Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 37th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on an anti-fa-la-la edition.
We've been waiting a long time to use that.
I wanted to use that, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And actually, the occasion was provided by an irascible correspondent of ours, Louis Proyect, who wrote this week, and I quote, neither David nor I always agree with Louis, but he's always provocative and knows a fair amount about what's going on in the American left for the last 50 years. He wrote this week, "The masked idiots who punched out that's a taste of his style. The masked idiots who punched out photographers in Berkeley are on the left, but they're also an obstacle to building the kind of left we need. We need to build a revolutionary socialist movement, not some misbegotten leftist movement that keeps shooting itself in the foot. I lived through that with the Weathermen, the Maoist idiots, and the Trotskyist cults of one sort of another 45 years ago. Let the dead bury the dead." I'm not sure Louis knows exactly what he's quoting there in that last line, but in any case, the sentiment about Antifa was sharply expressed by Louis, and that was the occasion, at least, for the discussion, for tonight's discussion. David, what's on your list?
Well, quite a few things, and
Okay.
I'll try not to be too long-winded about it. Let me first say that Louis Proyect has called me worse than what he was calling in that on the comment section on his blog, which our problem, of course, has a lot to do with Syria and his accusations against those of us who oppose what we call U.S. imperialism in Syria. But that aside, let me also refer to, interestingly, a recent lecture given by Vijay Prashad over at the Spurlock Museum under the Millercom program.
Oh, yes.
A good turnout to interestingly talk about the role of Marx in the Third World in the years around and after World War I and since then. And just interesting to comment on. You can get a couple of hundred of the local intellectual elite to hear a guy like Vijay Prashad, who I think is a Marxist and really kind of a Leninist Marxist in a certain way, and they will flock in there to hear him, and he's an incredibly engaging speaker and did a really good job. But we might like to throw that into the hat in terms of understanding how academia really works around here in relationship to all the things we usually complain about in terms of identity politics and so forth. They were perfectly willing to entertain a Marxist, albeit a dark-skinned Marxist, a Marxist of South Asian Indian background, but be that as it may. Let me throw in a good word here for this is the only thing that's really left over from the 2 or 3 weeks that we haven't done a program that I wanted to mention. Was a very interesting interview that Abby Martin did on Telesur, a couple of interviews perhaps, with a fellow named Peter Joseph, who I'd never heard of, talking about how our economic system works. And one of the takeaways of that, and that's something I've been interested in talking about in terms of finance and pensions and how all this saving money really works for people, he mentioned the fact that I had not heard before, to go along with all of the data that we've been talking about for many years on this program, that 83% of stocks, and I assume that's privately owned, family-owned stocks, are owned by the 1%. So we can add that to the idea that the 1% make 20% of the income, have 40% of the overall wealth, and 83% of the stock wealth. And then we can talk about neoliberalism in terms of how it's evolved in relation to the stock market in the last 40, 50 years and what that all means. But let's turn to foreign policy for a moment, if you will. I did myself a brief little project because I was concerned that we on the left don't talk enough about foreign policy. And by we on the left, I'm putting we in quotes, and I'm talking about about the now venerable 6-year-old Jacobin magazine, which was a product of some good young socialists who identify primarily with the Democratic Socialist of America, the DSA. And I looked through all their issues now, which are like 25 issues now, and they hardly talk about foreign policy at all. They talk about areas of the world. They've done some good area studies issues about Ireland and other places. But when they talk about U.S. foreign policy, it's rare. And we probably should be asking ourselves why that is, and how that fits into our criticism, what in a sense is self-criticism, and in some senses of how the left operates in this country, and how what has changed and what hasn't changed. Interesting op-ed a couple of days ago in the New York Times, co-authored by 2 senators, Lindsey Graham and Patrick Leahy, confirming that all of the right-thinking people think that U.S. foreign policy, internationalist, neoliberal, neoconservative foreign policy needs to get on track, and that Trump is a threat to that, and that needs to be fixed. And the New York Times readers, in response to that, throw up their hands and said yes, and pile their usual vitriolic abuse on Donald Trump, who just doesn't understand what America's role in the world should be. Right. And, and that just sort of fits into the usual pattern of what's going on now that needs to be sorted out. And I guess the general comment to back some of this stuff up in terms of identity politics that we've been dealing with, a letter I wrote to the News Gazette that was published yesterday. After it just got too much, I had to sit down and write something. Just too much confusion boats, as Bob Dylan said. And this relates to the Prashad appearance and the whole thing. What's up? For 40 years, all of a sudden, it became unfashionable to be a Marxist. When I went to college, Angela Davis, it happened to be I stumbled over Angela Davis when I showed up at UCLA in 1969, and she was a self-identified Marxist philosopher. She was in the philosophy department. She was in the process of getting bounced out of there. She's deteriorated, I think, a lot since then, and maybe that would make a good case study in the relationship between Marxism, identity politics, intersectionality, and the whole issue there. And all these issues that we've been talking about on this program for the last few weeks that we've done shows relate to each other. Identity politics, intersectionality, the Antifa and the alt-right, whether it's appropriate for those on the left, on the so-called left, to have alliances with those on the so-called right, the so-called red-brown issue that we were talking about previously on this program. That's been discussed that was the hot issue on Counterpunch for a couple of weeks there, with more of the consensus that we just can't deal with these fascists. And that, of course, relates to the fact that what is the Antifa really dealing with? And there was a point where I was about to come in when thought we were going to do a show, but it turned out we couldn't. And I was going to have to come in and apologize or recant, in a sense, that I just really understand how horrible things had gone down in Charlottesville. There was a fellow interviewed by Doug Henwood on his radio program named Wilson, who was talking about how horrible it really was and how these people really had to stand up to these people. And then you pointed out in this journal the response by the fellow, I'm blanking on his name right now.
Response by Nathan Robinson, who edits that.
Who edits Current Affairs, which made me recant my recantment. At least all this was going on in my head because we didn't do a show, so I didn't have a chance to unfool myself before I fooled myself again. But this is going back and forth, and I really, after there isn't a real clear account of what went down in Charlottesville, but I'm going to stick to the story that I pretty much started with here, the namby-pamby story, that these people, these counter-protesters, didn't really need to show up there. And counter-protesting in this case wasn't a good idea. I was interested to read even Glenn Ford on Black Agenda Report this morning, writing a good column and say, well, we do have to stand up to those neo-Nazis when they show up and blah blah blah. And I'm reading about the neo-Nazis. I'm looking at some of their websites, and I'm looking at what's alleged by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, and I'm saying, no, I'm sorry, this isn't real. This isn't. And Glenn Ford is saying that also. He's basically saying the real problem is the U.S. incarceration system. Okay, you want to talk about hate groups, talk about prisons. Okay, talk about cops, but don't talk about these so-called alt-right groups. And just a couple of side issues for that. Again, this morning, back to the foreign policy issue, or actually a broader foreign. I had to note this column in the New York Times, really revealing what elites think about this country and what they think we should be thinking. A woman who I'd never heard of, Megan L. O'Sullivan, wrote a column called "How Trump Can Harness U.S. Energy Boom." And it's kind of an important column in the sense that it reveals how elites are thinking about why they're, she's trying to kind of cajole Trump into going along with this idea that we should be exporting natural gas and doing fracking, as if fracking is this completely unproblematic thing. But she represents mainstream elite opinion in her background, which if you look up your background, you find out she's at your favorite place, the Kennedy School of Government, and the whole thing. She worked for Madeleine Albright, or she's associated with Madeleine Albright in some way or other, and everything. On the one hand, these people hate Donald Trump. On the other hand, they're putting out little bits of food to get him just come and play nice with us, Donald, and we'll be nice to you, for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. For the wrong reasons. Just one more note about Glenn Ford is he evokes, and this I think comes back to Angela Davis, who was part of the Black Panthers, and we should be people are looking at the Black Panthers from the 60s in this sort of historical and sometimes romantic and sometimes too uncritical way. But let's remind ourselves that the Black Panthers were Marxists, okay, and that should be understood and what that means. And I think Glenn Ford has done that in his writing when he refers to the Black Panthers. Has nothing to do with intersectionality. Back to my alma mater, UCLA, the origins of intersectionality are with a law professor there named Kimberly Crenshaw. And she's the most respectable African-American woman you could possibly imagine. But her theory, you're supposed to, if you're one of the good people, you're supposed to buy into that. And I didn't. I just kind of ignored it for a long time because it didn't interest me all that much. But now it's really coming to the fore that there's a certain aspect of that is not working well in our understanding of what's going on in the world. Daniel Biss, who is the great progressive white hope, has rejected his running mate, his lieutenant governor running mate, because he was discovered that he was a supporter of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, the BDS movement. Let me make this provocative statement about that. I don't care if Daniel Biss supports the BDS movement. I don't care if he supports Israel, says, standard, I support two states and all that. That's fine. It would have been perfectly respectable and honorable for Daniel Biss to say about his running mate and to his running mate, we don't agree on this issue, but we can get along this just fine. The BDS is an issue of tactics. Okay, I assume Biss voted for the bill in Illinois, which basically criminalized corporations who boycott Israeli corporations. So apparently Biss isn't quite there yet, but I could certainly imagine a decent, honorable person saying, we don't agree on this issue. I recognize your support for this. I don't support it myself. That would have been fine, but instead he had to jettison him. And finally, not to be missed, is Jeffrey St. Clair's tour de force of a takedown of Hillary Clinton this morning on Counterpunch of her new book. And let me just throw this out there, is that I've been trying to put my finger on Hillary Clinton for a long time, because she's kind of hard to decipher, but maybe not that hard, as Jeffrey, I think, argues. But I think one way to put it would be that if there's one person you want to compare Hillary Clinton to in this historical era, it would be Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she's like a failed Margaret Thatcher, but I mean, and maybe that's not fair. Okay, we're talking white woman and white woman, but still, it's like Hillary Clinton kind of wanted to be the Margaret Thatcher of this country. And
I think that's right.
We've had plenty of Margaret. We had Reagan, we had Bill Clinton, we've had everybody, but Hillary Clinton just wanted to secure the position of being a woman president, leading us in this neoliberal era, and other people have done it just as well, but she's been very much a part of all that.
To go back to the top of your list, David, I will remind you are watching news from Neptune. Carl Estabrook and David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media, and David has just set out a wide-ranging menu of delights that we can choose from. I think I might start with the first one he mentioned. We were talking about a blogger by the name of Louis Proyek, who blogs under the title The Unrepentant Marxist, in which Proyek is Proyek's about my age, I think, and he talks about his long history on the American left, particularly the Marxist-Leninist left, and is an occasion for occasionally insightful comments about that. The invocation of Karl Marx is perhaps particularly appropriate, not only because of the importance of what he said a long time ago, but because there's an anniversary. It's 150 years ago this week that the first volume of Capital, an unfamiliar term in some ways at the time, was published. And the inspiration for this program and for the political views that, insofar as the overlap, David and I share, Noam Chomsky has a trenchant comment about the position of the Marxist tradition in regard to what he takes to be a reasonable politics today. The comment is as follows: I think that the libertarian socialist concepts, and by that I mean a range of thinking that extends from left-wing Marxism through anarchism, are fundamentally correct, and that they are the proper and natural extension of classical liberalism into the era of advanced industrial society. Close quote. And the only problem with that comment, clear as it seems, is that the terms keep moving around on us. All of those terms, libertarian, socialist, even Marxist, but also liberalism and so forth, have mutated a great deal even in recent political discussion. And you've got to say what you mean when you use them, because if you don't, you are off on a wild goose chase that ends up in the usual confusion that the left finds itself in this country. I must say that comment that I quoted there, I heard Noam Chomsky himself deliver in the year 1970. So even the language being used in it has had plenty of time to mutate, and indeed it does. And we've got to stop every now and then and sort out what we mean by these terms. There is an extremely good piece in our favorite political blog or newsletter, Counterpunch, by a woman called Radhika Desai about the anniversary of the publication of Capital. She says, Marx was the best hated and most calumniated man of his time, Engels remarked at his graveside oration when Marx died in 1883 in London. His funeral was attended by a number of his friends and followers, and Engels made a very important comment about who and what Marx was. Engels remarked, as he did in the graveside oration, because he discovered two things that struck at the heart of capitalism. Firstly, it was neither natural nor eternal. It rests on entirely unnatural historical processes, forcibly or fraudulently separating the mass of humanity from its means of production, leaving it dependent on employment by the appropriators of those means. Such a contradictory and antagonistic social order had to end. The only question was whether it would take humanity with it, and that depended on the choices humanity made. Secondly, Marx discovered the special laws of capitalism, how workers were exploited for surplus value, how capitalists and other property owners struggled over its distribution, and because capitalism does not have a global political economy, but a geopolitical economy in which states and their relations are central, how these contradictions manifested themselves in international competition and imperialism. The first volume of Capital, published 150 years ago this September, is an exposition of the second discovery and rests on the first. It's historical in two senses. Its capitalism is historically specific, with a particular place in the past and future of humanity. And the contradictory dynamics of the struggles between and within classes and nations that propel its turbulent and crisis-ridden history show that capitalism was made and can be unmade by social choices. That is why Capital also became part of history of the capitalist world as no other book, with working class movements and revolutions organized under its banner in an arc of popular struggle stretching more than a century until recent neoliberal decades. Close quote from Radhika Desai on the anniversary of the publication of Capital. And the lecture, which unfortunately I wasn't able to hear, by Prashad that you described, is absolutely appropriate, understanding both the historical extent and limitation of Marxism as a discussion, as a theory, as a discussion of theory of the behavior of the modern world. And it's a place that I'm actually rather remarkably surprised that, in spite of all the errors and misinterpretations, is back in the discussion now, as it hasn't been for a very long time. I would be surprised if you had described to me even 20 years ago the centrality of the discussion as it exists today. Happy anniversary to the publication of the first volume of Capital, and on with the show.
Yeah, and again, just to point out, it seems like the people who are promoting intersectionality kind of want to have it both ways.
Yes.
They want to say that they recognize class, and they're not, I think they might want to claim that they're not simply reducing class to a person's identity, that or even just reducing it to a person's income, that they somehow these are people that know enough. These are people that are not stupid. They know enough to understand class as the economic relations that we have in a society based on people who own the means of production versus the people who labor to produce those products. But it doesn't really seem to play out that way when you start getting knee-deep into intersectionality and all the different identity aspects of that regarding race and gender and other aspects. You get lost in this thicket of everybody. I guess what I've been thinking the last few days after unfortunately reading some things on Facebook, which I try to avoid these days, is that there's a kind of what's going on, it seems to me, is a kind of performative politics. People are very anxious to demonstrate to other people that they are not placing their group of people before any other group of people, that they recognize everybody else, everybody's oppression and everybody's identity, everybody's particular needs, and that they somehow want to meld this into some kind of universal field theory, some general, whatever it's called,
right,
general field theory, some kind of Higgs boson kind of a theory that explains everything. And in that, inevitably, the understanding of social class gets lost. It isn't that Marx or Engels or anybody else is saying that human beings are more than their productive capacities, or it isn't that they're not more than their labor. That was the point, to understand how labor relates to all of this, relates to other aspects of our lives, and how capitalism has changed that in the manner in which we think of ourselves as human beings, as you're always referring to in your quotation of Marx about work of hand and heart and so forth. That just inevitably gets lost in discussions of intersectionality and of various groups. And at the risk of being a couple of white men sitting here talking in general terms about all these groups.
Risk hard to avoid.
Pardon?
Nothing. I say that's a risk hard for us to avoid.
Yeah, right. that obviously it's important to recognize what oppression is, how it works in people's minds, some of the aspects of it as we of privilege as we lead our social lives. But the one person, I think, the person who is probably the best antidote to any of this is Adolph Reed.
Yes, I think he is.
And I know you always refer to Walter Ben Michaels also.
Mm-hmm.
But the two of them
They
have
see it-
actually written
yes.
some things, have jointly written some things, or at least one thing. And
Right.
Adolph Reed, who is a black man, really has in terms of race and class, has really explained very well to us in his writing, which is well worth reading and available online, about how we can better understand these things so as to avoid the pitfalls of identity politics. This isn't simply an academic argument. This is being played out in a pretty serious way now during the Trump era in terms of people understanding what is actually going on and what is to be done.
Let me see, David, if I can say succinctly, since I'm rarely able to say anything succinctly, what the problem.
That would be a first for either of us on this program.
Hey, time grows short.
Yeah.
That's all right. Who likes tall time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
In any case, there is an intellectual error, and therefore a political error, buried in the notion of intersectionality. The reason that the barbaric term should be avoided is not just because it's ugly, but because it has a mistake built into it. Let me see if I can explain what that is. The mistake is to treat classism like, and that's a term that someone who speaks of intersectionality will use, to treat classism as in some way parallel to racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, and that classism becomes just another form of discrimination, and all the various forms of discrimination in the theory of intersectionality have to be put together so that you can see how they interrelate, how discrimination in one area is like discrimination in another area, and indeed all must therefore be opposed. The problem is that classism is not like racism and sexism. To put it as sharply as I can, your class position is objective. You belong to it whether you know it or not. Your position in regard to race, sex, and the other forms of discrimination is a matter of choice. As we have seen even in terms of the trans issues that have been argued about, even in philosophy journals recently, identity is subjective. If identity is subjective and class is objective, then the shift from one to the other needs to be accounted for. We need to be aware of it. The way it's been done by people who speak of intersectionality is to turn your class position from its objective status into an identity. You identify as working class, upper class, the 20%, what have you. And that's the error. That's the mistake. if a mistake arises from the great error made by American liberalism in the 1970s, where it gave up class politics, politics based on the objective position that people have from the process of production, as Marx described quite clearly 150 years ago, to shift from that into a class identity which is subjective and taken on the same way one takes on one's other identities. Now, once we realize that intersectionality is a way to try to avoid the distinction between class politics and identity politics by reducing class to just another identity, a subjective position, then we can go back and begin to talk about where our politics actually come from and what has to be done with them, and why class politics abandoned for identity politics is the great modern liberal error, the great error of what we laughingly call the left in America.
That was almost succinct.
Well, you should have heard the original version.
Yes.
Actually, you have heard the original version for the last couple of years.
Probably, but that's okay. That's fine. Thomas Frank has been being interviewed by Paul Jay, and he's not the only one, but he's written this book, Listen Liberal, a couple of years ago, and I mean, I'm sure he didn't have to think of this stuff. Somebody else would have thought of it. There is a meritocratic class, what he calls a meritocratic class of people, the well-educated people, the professional people, not just the Wall Street people, and a liberal class, as he calls it, and as Chris Hedges would call it, in his book, The Death of the Liberal Class.
Yeah, that's a very
yeah. So it's kind of intertwined in various ways, very different writing styles between Chris Hedges and Thomas Frank, but you look at the economic data and what you see, you look at the Piketty data and so forth, is that over the last 40 years, that top 10%, which used to get 30% of the income in 1980, now gets 40% of the income, and that comes out to a couple of $1 trillion divided up among 10% of the people. And they like that. They're mostly having pretty good lifestyles in that top 10% category, and they don't want to give it up. And they're looking to hang on to the idea, the old-fashioned idea that we should have given up years ago, that somehow American society was this elevator that you got on when you immigrated to this country or whatever, or even if you were poor, even if you were a slave, whatever, if your descendants, if your ancestors were slaves, that you can get on this elevator and that everybody can arrive at least the middle level. But the way that Piketty et al. Have begun to define the middle class is that next 40% after that top 10%, and that leaves 50% who's stuck at the bottom, and that bottom hasn't had a raise in real terms during that 35 or 40 year period. There's no meritocracy for them. There's no way you could possibly argue that the educational system is their hope for the future, except in individual instances that they will be glad to point out to you. But we just can't see, as important as education is, we can't seem to get over this idea that education is somehow some fundamental reform mechanism or some fundamental mechanism of social justice. As Thomas Frank points out when he talks about Obama and Hillary Clinton, is that they went to the same schools, they recognize each other, they have absolute faith in the power of education to rescue people from whatever background they might come from. And it's unlikely that that top 10% of the people, even if they flock to hear Vijay Prashad at the Spurlock Center, are going to, in any serious way, question that.
I think one of the first things to notice about the system of social relations that generate these cover stories like identity politics is that the system itself has changed remarkably in our lifetimes. maybe even in Ethan's lifetime. The fact of the matter is that inequality in America, inequality mean in an objective sense, not just whether you feel bad about it or not, but the objective situation, how you provide yourself with food, clothing, and shelter, and so forth. Inequality in that regard has changed remarkably in our lifetimes. You mentioned Thomas Piketty and his important book, Capital in the 21st Century. And he describes in that the situation in America and Europe particularly over our generation. The Second World War and the Depression shook up the class structure, the objective class structure in the United States and Europe, differently across the world, and the politics of the various countries were affected by the different ways it happened, but there was an overall pattern that was important. The Great Depression immiserated a lot of people. The Second World War killed a lot of people. It destroyed their social position in the largest possible way. But out of that war came a reconstruction of society from between 1945, when World War II ended, in the mid-1970s, that period that Thomas Piketty himself refers to as les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. Because what was glorious about them was the rebuilding after the Second World War, which had to be done in a more equal way, a less unequal way. And it's true that American inequality in American society, which peaked at the beginning of the Great Depression, declined from the war and the New Deal in this country and other political innovations across the world, including National Socialism in Germany, I might say, that the inequality, which declined from the 1930s to the 1970s, through the 1970s, with the rebuilding after the Second World War, reached a trough in the early 70s and turned around. And the turnaround in this country was not an accident. It was not like a phase of the moon or an eclipse or something. It was the direct economic policy of the American ruling class, the policy that goes now by the name of neoliberalism. The American business class, specific names include Lewis Powell of the Powell Memo and the Trilateral Commission. The American business class in the early 1970s saw that the general political mood that we call the 60s in this country was moving in a dangerous direction. It was moving in the direction of greater inequality, not in ideas, not subjective equality, but in actual economic equality. That scared them. Their rice bowl was being affected. The returns to the rich were going down. They had to do something about changing it, and they did. And what they did was the collection of policies that are referred to as neoliberalism: deregulation of business, destruction of unions, offshoring of labor, the suppression of wages. Wages in the United States peaked in 1973 and have been essentially flat since then for more than 40 years. The wages which had risen with the New Deal in this country, and even more with war production, those wages flattened out in the early 1970s, not by accident, but by the result of the policies that we give the general name neoliberalism to. Now, the reason that this history is so important is that inequality has increased rapidly since the 1970s and at an accelerating rate as a result of those policies. Donald Trump became president because he was the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack those policies. He attacked the neoliberal policies, which meant more inequality, and he attacked the neoconservative policies that meant more war. he did this in an inchoate and blustering way that allowed many people to say, I don't know what he's talking about, but some people certainly understood what he was talking about. The neoconservatives, for example, who had been firmly lodged in the Republican Party because they thought that was the more warlike of the two parties, or we could get into arguments about that as well, they fled the Republican Party when Trump was nominated and fled to Hillary Clinton as a reliable neoconservative and also neoliberal. The neoliberal spirit was nowhere better expressed than by Hillary Clinton in her own description of the deplorables. It was the deplorables who had actually suffered from 40 years of neoliberalism, and Mrs. Clinton knew perfectly well that they were not going to vote for her, so she had to find some other way to obfuscate the matter. The result was that we had a president elected to the great dismay of the American ruling class who said he was not a neoconservative or a neoliberal. And the result, and by the way, it should be clear here, those terms neoconservative and neoliberals are not opposite, they're parallel. Neoconservative just refers to foreign policy, and neoliberalism refers to economic policy. What the first months of the Trump administration has done is captured those anti-neocon and anti-neoliberal sentiments expressed by Trump and turned them around. And they turned them around, and they turned Trump into a president who is following the policies that Hillary Clinton would have followed in office, that Barack Obama had in fact followed in office, and that can be described in this classical description of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. We have a neoliberal and neoconservative president, as far as policies are concerned, as we always have for the last 40 years, and everyone goes home happy, except Mrs. Clinton, in the fact that it wasn't she who was doing the work.
And we can go back to 2006 and look at David Harvey's book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, or if you don't want to read the book, which isn't a very long book, you could watch a sort of a 12, 13-minute animated version of that book on YouTube somewhere, produced by a group called RSA Animate I think at the London School. But or if you want a different perspective, sort of the continuity perspective rather than the break perspective or the discontinuity perspective, you could look at Leo Panitch and Sam Ginden's book from 2012, The Making of Global Capitalism. It's a difficult read, but I think they get a lot about how financialization especially has been involved in all of this. But getting back to we're trying to, let me see. How do we?
It's your deal. Take your pick.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of wanting to get back to the thing that we were going to talk about a week or two ago, and the whole thing that was spurred by Charlottesville and the Antifa and so forth, and what really happened. And it sort of became like, well, am I being a wimp by thinking that these people shouldn't have been, these counter-protesters should have been there? I mean, you hear that Cornel West and several other people of the cloth were allegedly feel like they had their lives saved by some of these Antifa or whatever whatever group they call themselves in, and it's hard for me to believe. Maybe I'd be naive about people who are capable of. Obviously, some guy who showed up at that event was capable of killing a woman with his car. But it's hard for me to believe that a bunch of people in one of these, whatever neo-Nazi clan, whatever group it was, are going to kill a bunch of people dressed in their pastoral robes, or Cornel West in his Brooks Brothers suit. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me that how are they going to do that? Were they going to strangle them? Were they going to, it's just that these things get, and the reality of it becomes so confused, and then people just run with it. And so that's why, if you want to hear the interviews, you can listen to Doug Henwood's interview in his Behind the News program, which is also a podcast. You can hear his interview with this fellow Wilson, forget his first name, Jason
yes,
Wilson,
that's right.
Basically, which got me to thinking, well, maybe this is worse than I really thought. But then I heard this fellow, Nathan J. Robinson, being interviewed by Chuck Mertz on the This Is Hell radio program podcast, and I thought he spoke really well to the idea that it seems it wants to be seen as rather as some people are presenting it as rather naive, that people believe in freedom of speech for some other people, and that there's these things going around about freedom of speech, and like, just to say what Chomsky always says, that you don't believe in freedom of speech unless you believe in for freedom of speech for the ideas that you most despise. That obviously doesn't mean that freedom of speech in all times and all places is an absolute given. That doesn't mean that everybody has a right to have a platform at UC Berkeley, but it is very odd that there's all this at Berkeley right now. There's all this fuss over whether people can even be allowed to speak that are being invited by a student group. And I just have to reflect on my experience on this campus for the past 17 years, especially at the height of the fact that when Zionists were feeling very empowered to invite all these people to this campus, people that I would consider every bit as horrible as Ann Coulter or this guy Ben Shapiro, saying some pretty awful things about what was going on in Israel, in Palestine, some pretty racist things. And there were people being invited not just by student groups, but by faculty members. You know, I remember going to hear this Israeli fellow, Yossi Klein Halevi speak. And he's respectable for sure. He's a writer for sure. But he comes out of an extremely Zionist, racist background. And he's trying to sort of present himself as this liberal Israeli, you know, and it just didn't work at all. But he came, he went. There was a little bit of a fuss made mostly by me. And now is it a little bit by you, mostly by me. And, you know, he went, and I'm thinking, you know, that was like the good old days when people could just sort of come in and mix it up a little bit verbally. There were speakers at Allen Hall. There was speakers in various places. I got banned from Hillel in 2008 because I got a little bit out of line, but it was really only about speech. This guy from the Israel lobby said what he had to say, and I kind of said what I had to say in a kind of disorderly way. But those were the good old days. And now this younger generation is coming up with this idea that you can just shut people down. And people that I respect are agreeing with them, people that seem to be wavering on their understanding of this. Even people like, I'm not sure if I should throw Paul Street into this category, but he's somebody who's certainly been like, these people are just dying to convince themselves that there's this massive white racist identity out there that needs to be stood up to and sometimes put down. And I'm not seeing it. You could look at Paul Street's column this morning and see what he has to say about that.
There is a real problem here, I think, on several levels, and in at least one of those levels, it's the problem that we've been talking about between class politics and identity politics. When American liberals gave up class politics in the 1970s, they had a bad conscience about it. They felt bad about it. The class politics that in its various ways had animated American politics from the New Deal, from the Depression, through the war, and through the 60s, the 60s in its mythic dimension, the class politics were abandoned by American liberals in the early 70s, and they, in their embarrassment, they cast around for another good cause. If they weren't going to change the class structure in America, if they weren't going to change the sort of thing that Marx had analyzed a century and a half before, if they weren't going to change the forms of exploitation upon which American society was built, which the New Deal in some sense wanted to do, if they weren't going to do that, they had to do something nice. And so they looked around and they saw people being discriminated in this society on the basis of race, sex, taste, what have you. And they said, well, we've got to stop that. Discrimination is identity politics' notion of or explanation for inequality. Why is there inequality? Because some groups are discriminated against. get rid of inequality,
And
sorry,
they
get rid of
climb
discrimination.
the ladder, just climb
Exactly,
the ladder.
and go back to the notion that careers are open to talent,
Yeah.
and therefore people will get what they deserve on the basis of their talents. This is nonsense, of course.
Yeah.
Nonsense, and because it ignores the sort of
Yeah.
exploitation that Marx was quite clear about a century and a half before. But the notion that by tackling discrimination, American liberals could save their souls, or at least salve their conscience, was spread abroad in the 1970s. And I think that you can draw a fairly straight line from that great refusal by American liberalism in the 70s to Antifa. Antifa represents an overripe extreme of identity politics. It accepts the abandonment of principles, as you mentioned before, free speech and nonviolence, in opposition not to silent exploitation, but to public assertion of extreme discrimination, of white supremacy. This white supremacy talk is so bad, this Nazi talk is so bad, that we have to give up notions of free speech, such as those Chomsky was talking about. No, Antifa says that's necessary. Antifa says it's necessary because what's being asserted is so bad. The discrimination that's being asserted. The discrimination leads to the Holocaust. The discrimination that's being asserted leads to oppression around the world. Bit of an embarrassment there because the United States is not killing people in the Middle East for white supremacy, but still in all the notion is discrimination is so bad that, of course, it has to be opposed. Antifa is the notion that we have to give up principles of how we behave politically, such as not hitting people who want to talk, who want to say something wrong. We have to give that up in order to oppose this sort of extreme discrimination, which we now call white supremacy. Antifa is the dead end to which the liberals' abandonment of class politics 40 years ago has led. Unable now to call out the objective source of our immiseration, that is capitalism, they're reduced to raging at those who viciously assert discrimination, neo-Nazis, as if they were the source of inequality. They aren't.
Yeah. I think through the 1960s, the middle class there were two aspects of the middle class. There was the unionized worker middle class, manual worker or factory worker, and other aspects of that. That's reducing it a bit. And there was a kind of managerial middle class, which was not unionized, but probably understood much better than it does now that somehow their prosperity, the general prosperity, depended on unions. And now what we have is a strange process by which the unions, as you mentioned before, have basically been gotten rid of in the private sector, and what's left are unions in the public sector. And we have a managerial professional class that it's lost any identification whatsoever with the union movement and with the general prosperity that it gave us. But that's again to say that the union movement, the war against labor, of course, began in earnest with the passage of Taft-Hartley legislation in 1947. And as powerful, as prosperous, generally speaking, as unions were through the 1970s and into the 80s, into the Reagan era, they were always on a somewhat tenuous, there was something tenuous about that in terms of their position vis-a-vis capitalism, vis-a-vis the non-unionized working class, and vis-a-vis the managerial professional classes, which they trusted to kind of take care of them in a certain way, but which abandoned them. And the professional class, especially the college-educated, graduate school-educated, the emerging professional medical and legal classes, and most of all, of course, the financial Wall Street class. I mean, these are all the educated people that no longer could care about the working class or about unions, and that's just to reinforce, to punctuate what you have just said.
Marx, we've been talking of this evening in regard to the anniversary of the publication of Capital, said early on that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. What American liberalism gave up in the 1970s was any notion, any attention to class struggle in the United States, and it had instead to look at at politics as a matter of other struggles, as a struggle against discriminations of various sorts. Now that abandonment of the awareness that class struggle is built in to capitalism was the original sin of contemporary liberalism. Class struggle is not something that you're in a position to start. Class struggle is not something that occurs when we get a group of hotheads together and say, hey, gang, let's have a class struggle. No. Class struggle is description of the process of how we produce food, clothing, and shelter. That's what Marx was on about. It is necessarily, in the modern world, a system of class struggles, and those struggles are real struggles. They're not something we can just choose to ignore, as identity politics did. And as I say, the rotten fruit on the tree is Antifa. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 37th week of 2017, an anti-fa-la-la edition, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green. Produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.